Before Europe had banks, before Columbus ever set sail, before the word wealthy meant what it means today, one empire already held half the world's gold. Its king walked into Cairo and collapsed an entire economy simply by being generous. His name was Mansa Musa. His empire was Mali, and the world has never properly given it the credit it deserves. If you have never heard this story, stay until the end, because what this empire built, what it controlled, and how it shaped the modern world will permanently change the way you understand history. Subscribe and hit the notification bell right now. History this powerful should never be forgotten again. To understand the Mali Empire, you have to forget everything you think you know about medieval Africa, because the story the West has told of a continent without civilization, without science, without empire, is not history, it is propaganda. And it starts to fall apart the moment you look at the facts. In the 11th century, West Africa was one of the most economically significant regions on the planet. The Sahara Desert was not a barrier, it was a highway. Camel caravans moved across it, carrying gold and salt, the two most valuable commodities in the medieval world. And at the center of those trade routes sat a succession of powerful West African kingdoms. The first of those great kingdoms was the Ghana Empire, not located in modern Ghana, but in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. The Ghana Empire controlled the goldfields of Bambouk and Bouré and dominated the trans-Saharan trade for centuries. Arab scholars who traveled there in the 9th and 10th centuries described the kingdom of extraordinary wealth and military strength. The king of Ghana reportedly commanded an army of 200,000 soldiers, including 40,000 archers. But by the early 13th century, the Ghana Empire had weakened, pressured by drought, internal conflicts, and the rising power of the Almoravid movement from the north. The power vacuum it left behind would be filled by a people called the Mandinka, from a region along the Niger River. And the man who unified them and forged what would become the Mali Empire was a warrior king named Sundiata Keita. According to the oral histories preserved by West African griots, the traditional historians and storytellers, Sundiata was born with a physical disability and could not walk as a child. He was mocked and dismissed, but he grew into a man of extraordinary physical and political power. In 1235, at the Battle of Kirina, Sundiata defeated Sumanguro Kante, the ruler of the Soso kingdom, and unified the Mandinka clans under a single banner. The Mali Empire was born, and it would grow into something the medieval world had never seen. What made Mali extraordinary was not just its military power, though that was formidable. What made it extraordinary was the system it built. A system of trade, taxation, governance, and knowledge that functioned at a scale that rivaled anything in the medieval world. At its height, the Mali Empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of modern Senegal in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, an area of roughly 478,000 square miles. That is larger than Western Europe. It encompassed the modern nations of Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Gambia, and parts of Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The empire's economic engine ran on two commodities, gold and salt. Gold came from the mines of Bambouk and Bouré in the west. Salt came from the massive deposits at Tagaza in the north, where the resource was so abundant that houses were reportedly built from blocks of it. Mali controlled both ends of this exchange, and it taxed every transaction that moved through its territory. Every ounce of gold that entered or left the empire passed through the hands of the Malian state. Historians estimate that during the 14th century, Mali was producing and trading more than half of the entire Old World's gold supply. That is not an exaggeration. That is the documented scholarly consensus. The gold fields under Mali's control were the primary source of gold for North Africa, the Middle East, and through those regions, for Europe. The coins circulating in medieval European cities, the gold dinars, the florins, were struck from metal that came ultimately from West Africa. To hold an empire of this size together, Mali developed a sophisticated administrative structure. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a local official called a farba, who reported to the Mansa, the emperor. A professional army of cavalry and infantry maintained order and defended the borders. The cavalry were equipped with horses, armor, and iron weapons, and they were considered among the finest mounted soldiers in the region. But Mali's most underappreciated institution was its preservation of knowledge. The griots, oral historians who memorized generations of royal history, law, and tradition, were the empire's living archive. And increasingly, written scholarship flourished alongside oral tradition. The city of Timbuktu, which came under Malian control in the 14th century, would become one of the greatest centers of learning in the entire medieval world. In 1312, a man named Musa Keita ascended to the throne of the Mali Empire. History would know him as Mansa Musa, Mansa meaning King of Kings. And by any measurable standard, Mansa Musa was the wealthiest individual human being who has ever lived. Modern economists who have attempted to calculate his net worth in today's terms have reached figures that exceed the combined wealth of the world's current richest billionaires. Some estimates place his personal fortune at the equivalent of 400 billion US dollars. Others say that number is itself an underestimate, because the gold reserves he controlled were so vast that assigning a modern dollar value to them is almost meaningless. He was not just rich, he was in a category of wealth that the modern world does not have a vocabulary for. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, and in 1324 he made the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. What set his pilgrimage apart from any other in history was the scale of what he brought with him. Contemporary accounts, including those recorded by Arab historians Al-Umari and Ibn Khaldun, describe a procession of staggering proportions. Musa traveled with an entourage of approximately 60,000 people. He was accompanied by 12,000 personal servants, each dressed in silk and brocade. Ahead of him marched 500 servants, each carrying a golden staff weighing roughly 6 pounds. His baggage train included 80 to 100 camels, each loaded with between 300 and 400 pounds of gold dust. The procession passed through the Sahara, through Egypt, and onto the Arabian Peninsula. And everywhere it went, Mansa Musa distributed gold. He gave it to the poor. He gave it to scholars. He gave it to the leaders of the cities he passed through. He commissioned mosques to be built along his route. He was, by all contemporary accounts, extraordinarily generous. But that generosity had an unintended consequence that no king in history has ever replicated. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo in 1324 and spent and distributed gold on a massive scale, he flooded the Egyptian gold market. Supply went up. Value went down. The price of gold in Egypt collapsed. Inflation spread through the North African economy. According to Al-Umari, who wrote about this 15 years after the event, the Egyptian gold market did not fully recover for more than a decade. Mansa Musa, without armies, without war, without a single act of aggression, had destabilized a regional economy simply by being generous while passing through.
The reverberations of that journey reached Europe. In 1375, Majorcan cartographer Abraham Crescus completed the Catalan Atlas, one of the most detailed and important maps of the medieval world. On it, for the first time in European cartographic history, appeared a black African king seated on a throne, holding a gold nugget, wearing a golden crown. The label identified him as Musa Mili, Mansa Musa of Mali. Europe had been forced to acknowledge that somewhere to the south, beyond the Sahara, there was a king richer than any of theirs. That image changed how European explorers and merchants thought about Africa. It contributed directly to the European hunger for African trade routes that would shape the next 2 centuries of history. After his return from Mecca, Mansa Musa brought back with him an Andalusian poet and architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. He commissioned al-Sahili to redesign and expand Timbuktu, and what emerged was one of the most remarkable cities in the medieval world.
Timbuktu had existed as a trade settlement since the 12th century, sitting at the point where the Saharan caravan routes met the Niger River. Under Malian rule, and in particular after Musa's Hajj, it became something far greater. At its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu had a population of approximately 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time, comparable in size to contemporary London or Paris. The centerpiece of the city's intellectual life was the Sankore Mosque and its associated university, an institution that predated the University of Oxford and was, in terms of student population, among the largest universities in the world at its peak. Estimates suggest that Sankore University enrolled as many as 25,000 students. Subjects taught included Islamic law, mathematics, astronomy, history, philosophy, and medicine. Scholars came from across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe to study there. What has only become clear to the wider world in recent decades is the sheer volume of written knowledge that Timbuktu produced and preserved. Researchers have identified more than 700,000 manuscripts in libraries and private collections in and around Timbuktu, written in Arabic and African languages, covering every field of human knowledge. These manuscripts include works on algebra, optics, political theory, medicine, and diplomacy. They demonstrate, beyond any reasonable argument, that West African civilization in the 14th and 15th centuries was not merely equal to contemporary European civilization in intellectual sophistication. In many areas, it was ahead of it. The Jinginga Rebbe Mosque, constructed in 1327 under Mansa Musa's patronage and designed by al-Sahili, still stands today. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and remains one of the finest examples of Sudano-Sahelian architecture on Earth. Its construction used sun-dried mud bricks and featured distinctive protruding wooden beams that served as scaffolding for the annual replastering that preserves the structure. It was built by an African king, designed by an Andalusian architect, and has stood for nearly 700 years. Beyond Timbuktu, the Mali Empire's trade corridors connected West Africa to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and ultimately to Asia. Goods moved along these routes in both directions, gold and kola nuts going north, salt and cloth and copper going south. The commercial networks Mali established were the original infrastructure of globalization in the Western Hemisphere of the Old World. Mansa Musa died around 1337, and with him died the unifying force that had held the empire together at its peak. What followed was a succession crisis that would take decades to fully unravel, but unraveled it did. The Mali Empire had no fixed law of succession. Power passed through a combination of lineage and political maneuvering, and after Musa's death, his son Magan I was unable to maintain the empire's cohesion. The Tuareg people of the Saharan fringes began raiding Malian territory with increasing boldness. Tributary states that had accepted Malian authority under threat of military force began to assert their independence. The most consequential of those breakaway powers was the Songhai Kingdom, centered on the city of Gao on the eastern Niger Bend. The Songhai had been nominal subjects of Mali for generations, but in 1430, under the leadership of their rulers, they expelled Malian forces from Timbuktu and Gao and began building their own empire. Over the next several decades, the Songhai Empire would absorb much of what had been Mali's eastern territories, including Timbuktu itself. The Mali Empire continued to exist in a reduced form for another century and a half, controlling its western heartland, but it was a shadow of what it had been. A series of weak rulers, internal dynastic conflicts, and continued pressure from the Songhai and the Tuareg steadily eroded its power and territory. The final blow came not from within Africa, but from across the Sahara. In 1591, the Saudian dynasty of Morocco, armed with firearms obtained through trade with Europe, sent an army of approximately 4,000 soldiers, including Spanish and Portuguese mercenaries, south across the Sahara. At the Battle of Tundibi, this army confronted the Songhai forces, who fielded a far larger army but were equipped primarily with traditional weapons. The outcome was devastating. The Moroccan muskets shattered the Songhai cavalry. The Songhai Empire collapsed within months, and with it, the last institutional framework that connected to the Mali Empire's golden age fell apart entirely. The cities of the Niger Bend, including Timbuktu, fell into a prolonged period of instability and decline. Trade routes shifted, scholars fled, the libraries were shuttered or hidden. What had been one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world was, within a generation, reduced to a collection of ruins, oral memories, and hidden manuscripts. The question is not only what happened to the Mali Empire. The question is why, for so long, so few people outside West Africa knew it had existed at all. The answer lies in the history of colonialism and the deliberate construction of a narrative that served European imperial interests. Beginning in the 15th century and accelerating through the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars, missionaries, and colonial administrators built an intellectual framework that described Africa as a continent without history, without civilization, without writing. That framework was not an accident. It was a justification. If Africa had no civilization, then colonizing it was not destruction. It was development. If Africa had no history, then there was nothing being erased. The manuscripts of Timbuktu tell a different story. For centuries, West African families hid and preserved hundreds of thousands of written documents at tremendous personal cost and risk. When the Moroccan army arrived in 1591, scholars and families buried manuscripts, disguised libraries, and carried documents into the desert to keep them safe. The Mama Haidara Memorial Library in Timbuktu today holds more than 40,000 of these manuscripts. In 2012, when jihadist groups occupied the city and threatened to destroy its intellectual heritage, librarians and community members secretly transported approximately 350,000 manuscripts out of the city in secret, hiding them in private homes and moving them south to Bamako for preservation. That act of cultural courage, people risking their lives to protect documents that most of the world did not even know existed, is one of the most remarkable archival rescues in modern history. The legacy of the Mali Empire is not only preserved in manuscripts, it lives in the legal traditions of West African communities, in architectural styles that persist across the Sahel, in trade networks whose routes still correspond to modern roads and railways, and in the cultural memory maintained by griot families, who have transmitted history orally for 7 centuries without interruption. The social structures, the music, the oral literature, and the governance traditions of modern Mali, Guinea, Senegal, and Gambia all carry the DNA of the empire that Sundiata Keita built and Mansa Musa made immortal. Here is what the record shows. 700 years ago, there was an empire in West Africa that controlled half the world's gold. Its capital cities were among the largest and most literate on Earth. Its university trained tens of thousands of students. Its king traveled to Mecca with more gold than any monarch in recorded history and accidentally destabilized a foreign economy with his generosity. Its scholars wrote on mathematics, medicine, law, and astronomy, while Europe was still centuries away from its own scientific revolution. That empire was not a myth. It was not an exaggeration. It was documented by Arab geographers, recorded in the world's most important medieval maps, and confirmed by the physical evidence of its architecture, its manuscripts, and its archaeological sites. The Mali Empire was real, it was great, and it mattered. The reason most people have never heard this story is not because it is obscure, it is because it was inconvenient. An African empire of this magnitude did not fit the narrative that justified colonialism, the slave trade, or the century of extraction that followed. So it was minimized, reduced to a footnote, left out of school curricula, treated as a curiosity rather than a cornerstone of world history. If you look at the Catalan Atlas of 1375, you will see Mansa Musa there, sitting on his throne, crowned in gold, holding a gold nugget, drawn by a European cartographer who had never met him but could not ignore him. He was too large, too wealthy, too real to pretend away. The same is true of his empire. No matter how long it was ignored, the evidence was always there, and now you have seen it. The Mali Empire did not fade into irrelevance. It was buried by war, by colonial narratives, and by centuries of deliberate omission. But now you know. Share this video.
make sure someone else hears the name Mansa Musa today. Drop a comment below and tell us what surprised you the most about this story. And if this kind of history matters to you, subscribe, because there are 100 more stories like this one, and we are just getting started.